Yep, that's great to see that feedback, and we definitely will get a chance to unpack some of the conversations that you had. And even moving into the final two presentations, and I'll explain to you why it's only final two, I think we'll once again have an opportunity to think about what are some of the nuances that you've had to unpack, and then how do you communicate around that. So our next presentation is from Angela Pham and Jasmine. You know, Jasmine never got the pronounced Thai from Facebook. We've had a long-standing connection to Facebook as a company through our program, and it started a few years ago when one of our, actually a couple of our more prominent graduates actually started to help create the content strategy practice at Facebook. And one of them, Andrea Zeller, I don't think she's here today, but she's a Hall of Famer. Oh, Andrea, are you here? She's a star. There's Andrea. So Andrea, we had one student who was in the program a few years ago who wanted to actually learn about content strategy, and it's a very nascent discipline. And so we said, oh, well, we're who we are. Let's just create a class for it. Who can we get to teach? And we got Andrea to teach. And then we created an online certificate program through Andrea on content strategy and storytelling, which is still available to the world, which has done very well for us. And so we've really helped try to define the space of content strategy in terms of what it means and how we can have an impact on it. So we're really pleased to see that so many of our graduates have gone to Facebook and done the work they've done. And because of Andrea and her influence with us, she reached out to us recently and said, well, Angela and Jasmine, it would be really great to speak on a really important subject around the idea of language, using language, especially with AI, and how to do so with care. As you've heard today, and as you've probably seen in the news over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of conversations about where technology is taking us in terms of how we do interact with each other, either well or very poorly. And you know, Facebook is at the center of a lot of that. And it's clear that they're also thinking, how do they look at this differently? So Angela and Jasmine have been at Facebook for respectively just under 2 years, and they have been, I know Angela's been working specifically on the integrity of the newsfeed, and Jasmine will talk a little bit more about what her work has been. And they come from from California in terms of the work they've done. Both, I think you were at Shutterfly, yes, and Angela worked over with, I have the firm, PwC, right. So they're fairly recent to Facebook and obviously have been navigating some of the larger issues and integrating into the work they do. So we thought it'd be really great to have them share their perspective and think more, not just about what's happening with what they're doing at Facebook, but also in technology generally. So with that, Angela and Jasmine.
Yeah, we can just pull up the slides. Oh, I will pull up the slides. All right, so what we wanted to discuss today has to do with a lot of folks here, whether your background is in tech and you're quite tech savvy or even technical, but for a lot of us here, I know we actually study or work in communications, are more of words people, the way that Jasmine and I are. So we wanted to describe how we use both language and words with care in this kind of machine learning world, where things are automated, but they're not necessarily autonomous, right? There are people behind the scenes like us helping influence these decisions and make experiences better for people. So I'm Angela Pham, and I'm a content strategist at Facebook. Specifically, I work on the newsfeed team.
And I'm Jasmine Thai. Oh, sorry. Does this work? Hello?
Jasmine, take that.
No problem. Hi, I'm Jasmine, and I work as a content strategist on the Messenger team at Facebook. Most recently, I've worked on M Suggestions, which is a completely automated, helpful assistant in your Messenger conversations that helps you enrich conversations and get things done, and it's powered by AI.
And how we define content strategy at Facebook is from a user experience lens. So it's basically thinking about the words we choose to use and why in the user interface. So that might look anything like, how do we describe what this menu item is? What should this call to action be on a button? Or the famous Facebook line, what's on your mind? That's all made with content strategists behind the scene.
But in the age of machine learning, even that definition is changing, right? It's evolving. Because there's so many machine learning technology that uses user-generated content, our role as content strategists become less about being the authors and the writers of the actual words and become more of the shapers of the experience. And I think this is most evident in predictive text suggestions. Has anyone used this, seen this anywhere, right? Now it's the world that's actually writing the content, right? And we're there to like help make sure that these experiences are positive. And so here are 5 things to think about when building with care. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and what this kind of looks like when you're thinking about how words get started in some kind of machine learning product is a lot of us think of things that we say across email or social networks as vastly unique and one of a kind, but if you have a look at some of these samples of popular user comments on something about like vacation posts or vacation photos, we actually ultimately say a lot of the same things over and over again, right? So if your friend takes a photo of a sunset, a lot of us are going to respond with something along the lines of, beautiful, wish I was there, great vacation spot, right? So that's kind of what forms the basis of products where content strategy can help influence what these predictive auto-suggestions might be in text form. And so what this looks like in products that I've worked on Newsfeed is something like this. So we have a Facebook post of a major life event that some friend went through, so she got engaged, and you see a number of different user comments kind of saying the same kind of sentiment, right? Congrats, congratulations, happy emojis, and so on. So at the bottom, you see examples of emojis that we might suggest just to make it easier for the user to go ahead and tap an emoji and say a form of congratulations. And on the other side, you can see examples with stickers as well. So what are some kind of appropriate sticker suggestions that we could make and hopefully learn over time using a machine learning model? What are the best things that people want to use for these kinds of posts on Facebook?
So here are the 5 things to think about to build with care. So the first question that you might run into when working with these types of products is what I find most interesting. Who is doing the talking? So there's a fascinating shift that occurs once a suggestion is surfaced and then once it moves on and the user actually chooses it. Because once the suggestion is surfaced, it belongs to the company, right? The company is the one doing the suggesting. It's presenting the options to you. But the minute a user taps it and sends it to a friend through an email or message, it becomes your words. It becomes your own. Your friend will never know that you tapped, this bubble, or if you had typed it yourself. And because of that, there's a tension between responsibility and empowering user expression. So, for example, in the first example that you see, if you see that phrase, that sucks, are you shaping the conversation to be a little more negative, right? But at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, if you have something that's very carefully crafted, like noted with thanks, is that inhibiting user expression? Is that the way that you would say it?
Which reminds me of, I remember when Gmail first rolled out their auto replies across different regions, and especially in the US. And I had a friend who was very much like a prototypical artist stoner type guy, right? And I remember the day his emails to me started sounding a lot more formal and stilted. And I remember thinking to myself, either this guy got his act together this year, or he's using every single Gmail suggestion, right? Which relates quite a bit to this quote I found from a tech blog from someone named Geek in Chief on Twitter. And he says that chances are that to save yourself the effort, you'll just start accepting Google suggestions. And all of a sudden, your voice is the same as everyone else's. So it does create this interesting experience over time where you can't necessarily differentiate between who typed this by hand and with care and who merely tapped a bubble and hit send, and does that create a different meaning for people? So that brings us to the second question you should ask when building things with care is, what are we actually helping people do better? So much like what was discussed earlier today in different ways, what's that people problem that we're trying to solve for? And so you can kind of take 2 different ways, right? You can think, do I want people to be more efficient and save time by using auto-suggested predictive text? Or do I want them to have more meaningful conversation? Do I want them to have more back and forth dialogue? And I worked on this framework at Facebook actually to help kind of solidify where I thought was our right place for some questions like this. So on one side of this framework, you've got the mundane, and on the other side, you've got the meaningful. One side is kind of throwaway comments, and the other side is thoughtful. And so on that mundane throwaway side, we've got something like a ha-ha. Like, is that useful enough that we should build a product that helps people say like LOL or ha-ha more easily? On the other extreme, you've got this very human, authentic, raw emotion, something like, I love you so much, my darling. Do we want Facebook to be the one suggesting you say this to your loved ones, right? That's probably not the place that we want to be in, and hopefully that's not the direction that most tech companies want to go. But so somewhere in the middle is what I consider that sweet spot. So the sounds good to me, right? It's enough to create expression, real conversation, but at the same time not trying to replicate the entire human experience.
So the third question is around language principles, right? People don't think about this, these rules, but there's a reason why you don't see profanity in predictive text, even if I know the world like curses a lot, because there are probably rules built around that, right? And from a textbook standpoint, I think it's very easy to say, oh, this should be capitalized, this should be punctuated, right? But when you're taking user expression into consideration, when you think about how is that going to come across, is that gonna, if every message I send is carefully crafted, like beautifully written, is it going to come across as inauthentic? What are our rules around internet speak? What are our rules around spelling errors? If machine learning models pull the most commonly used phrases and they just happen to be misspelled because the world does not know how to spell, are we going to perpetuate that kind of behavior, right? But at the same time, on the other hand, if we're sticklers about grammar and this is the way you need to speak English correctly, is that too prescriptive and just kind of aggressive on certain communities too? So those are the kinds of things we think about.
And if these sound like tough decisions to make and the kinds of issues that could keep you up at night, we can assure you that they are and they should. Jasmine and I work together on different types of projects along these lines, and it's definitely, you feel the weight of the world on making these kinds of decisions, right? You're shaping a lot of people's language usage for the future when you work on experiences like this. But one way that you can make these kinds of decisions more confidently is always go back to the principles. So most large tech companies at least have pretty fleshed out ethical principles around how they'll use AI and machine learning in their products. And on the screen are some examples of partnerships that actually Facebook has with Google, with different universities in the world. So if you ever find yourself in this kind of conundrum of how do I make a decision on something even as micro as grammar, right? Usually if you look back at the ethical principles that company and organizations have put forth, that can really guide you as to, is this the right thing to do for how my company says they want to use this cutting edge technology? And the fourth question to ask in order to build with care is how we serve the world and not just a subset of the world. So obviously this is particularly important at Facebook, where we've got over 2.5 billion users to think about. But it's surprising where these choices really come into play with predictive text suggestions. So even something like emoji suggestions carry a lot of potential bias and lack of inclusion in them. So if you look at the possibility, if we suggested that a user use the dancing red woman emoji, does that mean Facebook's making assumptions about their gender, right? If we suggest a pale flesh-colored thumbs up, is that us also making presumptions about their skin color? And maybe it's appropriate to suggest a skull as an emoji comment during November in Mexico. But if we did that in another region at a different time, you'd probably be a little creeped out if Facebook's like, skull of death, post this now, right? So trying to be as universal as possible, I thought was a great, at least beginning strategy too, to make sure that more people would feel comfortable using the product. And similarly at Facebook, a phrase we say a lot in our team is stress cases. also known as edge cases sometimes, but we prefer not to think of people on the edges. So making sure that no matter what experience someone is in, that we're thinking about the potential vulnerabilities they might be feeling, safety risks. So with this example here, when someone's asking you, hey, are you available to meet for coffee next week? And all 3 predictive text suggestions are a variation of yes, yes I am, yeah, let's do it, right? Particularly for women, right? Like, is that something you want to imply? What does that say about the product and the team members on the product that maybe these guardrails weren't put up? And so considering where people might be and making sure that everyone feels safe and comfortable with a product like this is also very important.
And our final question is, how do we build experiences if we're not the ones building the products? And I think this is really relevant for the audience today. I'm not writing the code, and you might not write the code, but what you can do is tell the story. You can articulate the vision, the user experience that you want to see in the world. In short, we need you. So there's a very simple line I like to use when I say that we need you. It's because people read words, not code. And I will say that again. People read words, not code, for all the communication professionals here, right? Diversity is essential, not just around gender and color, but also diversity of thought, because the way engineers might approach a problem is probably different from the way we would approach a problem. And you can't just have a room of engineers making all these decisions. You need to be part of that conversation. And when we think about shaping AI, we usually think about grand gestures like, I don't know, a TED Talk, a dissertation, a book. But the truth is, they probably come in everyday decisions, like grabbing coffee with an engineer that you're working with, or making sure you are added to that meeting that you need to be a part of. It's raising your hand and being an advocate for the user in the organization. And I did this in the only way I knew how. I presented it in a form of a poem, and I'll admit it's unconventional, and yes, my team thought I was nuts, but I did it anyway. So I'm just gonna read it. In all the conversations that happen day to day, it's easy now to reply thanks and okay, or to share cute stickers and funny gifts too, but what if you don't want to tell someone I love you? If machines help us communicate and get things done, how can we make things useful and fun? As storytellers and communicators, what is our role? How do we make machines have a soul? Do our suggestions represent Facebook and Zuck? And if so, we probably shouldn't surface curse words like, I'm not gonna say it. But on the other hand, are we controlling the choice and denying people of their own expression and voice? What is the line between creepy and cool? What are the guidelines for our large language pool? When are these welcome and when are they not? These questions are tough, and we have quite a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine and Angela. I might have to take one of your mics. Thank you, Jasmine and Angela, especially for those, well, the poem was great, but those concluding thoughts as well, especially to our audience about the role that they have to play. In fact, I almost paraphrased, be the change you want to be in the world, be the user experience you want to see in your company, right? To be able to think about that and to be able to advocate and lead from a communicator's point of view so that, no, you're not the people doing the coding and creating the technology, but you can influence that. And I think that's very much something we want to bring into this principles that we want to create through this event. So thank you for that. Now, Facebook has a huge amount of impact, obviously, given your user base and who you are. And some of this feels really new and obviously is at the early stages. It feels like we could almost start to think about what the next few years might look like as you grow this out. Are you even able to think about like what would this look like 5 years from now once it's all sort of taken place? Because you're still testing it, obviously, right?
Yeah, I think it's like easy to imagine like just kind of scenarios where machine learning gets smarter in subtle ways. So even when I was going through my news feed this morning, I had a friend in my network whose dog passed away. And, all of the comments are actually, devastated, sorry for your loss. And I think, and I hope that we continue to be, smart enough to know that there are certain places where suggestions don't make sense, right? And there are things that are like, sacred. And I think that's something that will always get better over time too with machine learning, is that you learn the nuances of humans and care and know the places where this is a good place to say something and a good place to say nothing at all. And I think even like a controversial political post can be a little bit subjective, where is this a place where we want Facebook to make suggestions? That can be a little subjective. I saw an example recently where there was a controversial political post, someone made a really big comment kind of combating it with a different viewpoint, and then we suggested a sticker that had different variations of a mic drop, like boom. And I actually thought, wow, like she did have a mic drop moment with her epic comment, right? And so was that a place where we should be or shouldn't be? I think that's where we're going to get better at learning those nuances of people's behavior.
And that strikes me as, and you've identified this as well, as the greatest challenge is equilibrium between our authentic human voice and a machine that's looking to emulate that authentic human voice. And I know that we all may have the best intentions, whether it's Facebook or us personally saying that we should always make sure we insert ourselves. But as this technology gets smarter and easier, I could very much see myself reverting to shorthand and using those suggestions. For example, this is not Facebook, this is Apple. I'm on one floor of our house, my wife's on the other, and she's making a coffee, and she asked me if I want a cappuccino or a tea. And it comes through on my iMessage. And before I can even think about writing out my answer, the suggestion has come to me through the iPhone. And I'm thinking, well, that's a really loving thing that she's just done. But I'm going to use AI or whatever, some suggestion to respond. And I'm very tempted by that. So how would you, if you even thought about a few years from now, what impact do you think this might ultimately have on human voice? Because we will want to use these. You want to, I know that I'm asking you science fiction questions at this point, but.
Yeah, I guess just off the cuff, it does feel like there's a lot to learn, and I was actually talking with some folks at lunch earlier today about this thing where I think algorithms have at least early on, a nature of like almost the second you do one thing, the classifier is like, oh, this is who you are forever now, right? Like on YouTube, I watch one stupid video clip, and then my entire homepage is stupid video clips, and then I become embarrassed of who I really am. I'm like, that's not who I really am. I did that once. So yeah, I mean, I know I've...
Clear your cookies.
I'm just going to make a plug here for content strategy, and that is why every organization needs content strategy, because content strategy is the organization that's thinking about the user experiences, right? Like, not what's out there, but how it affects and changes and things like that.
My final question is, we've been talking a lot about how you would use this for interpersonal communication between two people. Noelle didn't speak about this, but when I was looking at some of her work, Microsoft now has this option where you can take the URL of an FAQ page on a company's website and put that into this software, and all of a sudden you've got a bot that is reflecting the dialogue of the company from the FAQ. And I'm just wondering, there's obviously a huge opportunity here for a brand to have more of a human voice because it can use this technology. Is that something that's also a possibility at some point, that we could sort of extrapolate what's happening between people to sort of say companies and brands can use this as dialogue with their customers in the future?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of, like chatbot specific work that kind of gets into that, and I think that's so exciting because, that's like content strategists also work very closely with what's the brand voice, like what's the tone, and if it's a bot, do we match that, or do we actually want it to sound more human than what our brand voice was prior, and adjusting that to evolving over time. So I think it'll be interesting to track how even the way humans change over time is reflected in our bots and, Alexa devices as well, where, like internet speak has infiltrated even people who weren't internet natives, right? And I think like keeping up with that is going to be a huge challenge for anything that's using machine learning models.
That's actually a great visual, because I'm thinking about, if you watch an American movie from the 1940s or 50s, you always see how the actors and actresses have that very peculiar dialect that doesn't seem to exist anymore. It's sort of this weird New York accent, but it's very high inflection. And I read once that was partly because at the time when they were making those movies, microphone technology wasn't advanced enough. So they had to project in a way that was not normal. And all of a sudden that became a way of speaking because it so affected culture for a while. And now we speak normally because of what pop culture and technology do. So in a way, the technologies that you're developing could affect how we actually interact with each other, whether or not we have that interface between us. That's really interesting. Well, guys, Angela and Jasmine, thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us. It's really important to have that. Thanks very much. I didn't make the comment, but as you can see, we've made this transition now. into the third part of the day where we're looking at how do we start really making decisions and communicating around AI and using these tools to think about that and getting a little more practical. And so hearing from Facebook and thinking about what those communication tools are and how we influence the application of that is really important. And so with that, we originally had in the program Kevin Ackroyd, who's the CEO of Cision. Kevin was on his way here this morning from San Francisco and got into a pretty difficult accident where he actually emailed us from the ER saying that he can't make it because of the accident. Totally not his fault. It's really interesting, and what we're going to do is make sure that we have a really good relationship with him, and what Cision is doing right now in terms of content and influencer marketing using AI is really interesting. So I intend to do an interview with him at some point in the next few days, and we'll include some of that content when we send out some notes to you guys next week. What you should know is that yesterday, Cision bought a $225 million company. They continue to expand in this idea that they can create more dashboards around how to measure the impact of the communication and content that we make. So far, especially on influencer content, there's been this thinking that we just use YouTube views and retweets and everything else to measure whether Kim Kardashian really is an influencer. But the technology that's coming, fueled partly by machine learning and AI, and definitely championed by Cision, is very much more scientific, that you can actually, from beginning to end, track content created by a so-called influencer to see whether it truly is influential. And I could see that the impact of this a few years from now in terms of the future might be that just as we have schools for journalism and marketing, we actually might have a strong enough methodology to encourage a discipline around being an influencer. And how do you create content and be successful at it? And so that's what Cision is doing, and I encourage you to look them up, and we'll definitely include some of that content as we move forward with the next few days in terms of the outcome of this conference. So that leads us to the final formal presentation for this evening, for today, before we go to our last activity and then to a conversation with our friends from KUOW. But we wanted to leave this one for last because it gets to how we as communicators, sense makers, and storytellers convey the story of artificial intelligence. So we put ourselves through the rigor of this. We sort of said, okay, we understand artificial intelligence. We've identified that we may want to use it as a solution in a certain situation. And now we have to convince our stakeholders that this is okay, and that this is how we can explain it to them, this is how we want them to adopt it, and this is how they get comfortable with the idea of these new solutions and platforms. Very much like you were trying to convince people 20 years ago to use the internet. And Kerry Schimmelbusch is, I just lost my notes on Kerry. I know Kerry by heart, but Kerry Schimmelbusch is the Senior Communications Manager for Artificial Intelligence at Microsoft. We started with Microsoft, we end with Microsoft, leaves the formal presentations, but more importantly, Kerry was one of my former students and obviously a graduate of our program. And she's been just a remarkable professional who's charted an amazing career as she's gone from Weber Shandwick to Starbucks and now to Microsoft. And I've really trusted her in terms of what she's been seeing in her professional life to understand what's going on. And I fed some of her feedback into what we're doing with our graduate program. So I really rely on her as an ally of what we do. And her focus now into telling stories around artificial intelligence to engender trust as we think about this, I think is a good way for you to consider how we move to the final part of the day. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful graduate and alum, Kerry Schimmelbusch from Microsoft.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kerry Schimmelbusch. I am...
Sorry, Kerry.
That's okay.
That was really unprofessional.
Flip through these. There we go. So I'm Kerry Schimmelbusch, and as Hanson just said, I am an alum of the Communication Leadership Program. I see and have connected with so many people today. It's really great to see a lot of familiar faces. As Hanson mentioned, I am currently working at Microsoft, and I sit on our AI communications team. Prior to that, worlds colliding here for me, I spent many years at We Communications, who's a sponsor of this event, and really learned how to hone some of my communication storytelling skills. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about, all this technology that we've learned about today, the complication of how do we regulate, how do we build this technology, how do we think about it as a society? and implementing AI technologies for good. As a communicator, we are always thinking about that. And so I'm going to give you some really fun, great examples of what a great story looks like. And then I'm going to share some of the challenges that we had along the way. And then I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks. So have your notes ready. I see your notebooks out. I'll leave you with some tips and tricks that hopefully when you leave here today, you can bring some of these storytelling ideas into your organization and try them out for yourself. So I'm a storyteller, and I thought we would start our time together with a story. So I'm going to play this, and we'll talk about it in a minute.
Swiftly Symbols is a communication app for people who are non-verbal, and it supports them in expressing themselves.
The volume needs to go up a little bit.
Low-functioning autism. He finds it difficult to communicate and can get very upset if he can't make himself understood. I took what we used at home with some symbols that my mum would print out, laminate, cut out, stick Velcro on, put them into folders, and I just thought I could make that easier. We did it on an app, so more fun for Rowan because he loves technology.
The underlying AI technology which Swiftly Symbols uses is the same technology which powers the Swiftly keyboard. So we use AI technology to be able to learn from the user's behaviour, to see what they like to use in terms of their own style of language, to predict what's going to come next.
It works by having a library of symbols that you can pick and choose to build your sentence, and each symbol has a word associated with it. And we use SwiftKey AI predictive technology to learn what you've used previously, sentences that you've previously built, and then we surface what word you might want next and what symbol you might want next to build your sentence.
I want juice, please, Kate.
Wow! We developed it alongside Riverside School, which is a school specialising in learning difficulties.
To be able to express what they want without prompting is a really big thing. Go on then, ready? I want cow.
We have so many pupils who are non-verbal but still have so much to say.
I think AI can just make everything in life more efficient so you can enjoy life to the max.
There's no better feeling than to hear a child say something that they've wanted to say and the look on their face after they've been able to say it. You can't really beat that because that's them expressing themselves and that's really what you want from them.
It's joyous. I don't think I can think of a better word for it. It's complete joy and celebration.
So wow, right? It's pretty powerful. So this is an example of like the gold star of storytelling. So we as professional communicators, this is what we're always striving towards. We might not always hit something that emotional and pulling at your heartstrings, but it's definitely something that we're thinking about. And what we're trying to do is, you know, we talked earlier about how do we build these technologies? How are engineers and marketers talking about this? Well, let's communicate this in a way that people can understand, right? So taking the AI, the technology, and really talking about and showing your audience how this impacts people. So this SwiftKey video, and by the way, SwiftKey is a company that Microsoft acquired 3 years ago. So this is just a gold star storytelling, like I said before. It's emotional, it's visual, it's about the people, it's about these kids that are now suddenly able to communicate and express themselves. It's pretty powerful, right? It's not showing all the algorithms and the technology, and this is how we developed, and here's the bells and whistles. Well, that kind of communication is important for a technical audience, and certainly appropriate and important, and you should know all that when you get asked those questions. But this is really just, hey, this is impacting people in a positive way, and this is how we're going to show you we do this. So I love that example. It's one that really performed really well for us as a company. But in any storytelling initiative that you do, know that there's going to be challenges along the way. This one was no different. For this one, the team, I mean, you spend copious amounts of time scripting, setting up shoots, hiring videographers, audio support, editors, photo releases for all the families and children, making sure they understood how this was going to be used, how are you comfortable being on camera? And some families weren't comfortable. So we had to think about logistically, how do we make sure we're not disrupting the children's day, right? And making sure they're comfortable. But one of the interesting things that happened, the team was all ready to go, had the photo shoot a couple days, ready to go, and 3 days before, they realized that our legal team had some concerns on how we were talking about it, how we were positioning it. Oh, you can't actually name it that or call it that. So the team had to quickly rewrite and then realign all of the new narrative and the messaging with all the business stakeholders across the company, right? So just know, as you're thinking about storytelling, you're gonna hit challenges, and you just gotta make sure that you persevere and you keep pushing through, and you're gonna get there eventually. I have another example for you guys. This one's on Microsoft Translator, which uses deep learning to translate in real time in multiple languages. So we're gonna take a look at this, and then we'll talk about this one.
Hi, can you guess where I live?
¿Te encuentras en América del Norte?
Yes. Do you live in central Mexico?
Sí. ¿Te encuentras en Estados Unidos de América?
Yes. Do you live in a capital city?
Sí. ¿Estás cerca de Seattle?
You're very close to Seattle. Are you in Mexico City?
Sí. ¿Estás en Tacoma?
Yes. Very good guess.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Do you like living in Mexico City?
¿Te gusta vivir en la Ciudad de México?
Aquí está muy lindo.
Here is very nice.
What do you do for fun?
¿Qué haces para divertirte?
Voy a las playas de México.
I'm going to the beaches of Mexico.
I like to swim.
Me gusta nadar.
A mí también.
Me too.
Where in the world do you wish to travel?
¿A dónde en el mundo te gustaría viajar?
A Rusia.
To Russia.
¿Y tú?
And you?
Everywhere.
Sería increíble algún día verte en México.
It would be amazing to see you someday in Mexico.
I would really like to visit you sometime.
Me gustaría mucho visitarte algún día.
A mí también.
Me too.
So again, this is a really good example. Not quite, it's a little different from the one that I showed before on SwiftKey, but really showing how this technology is going to impact people, how it's impacting these children in these schools, and the joy that they see when they can communicate with a new friend between Tacoma, Washington, and Mexico City in real-time conversation. So it's not the back-end technology and the development and the engineering and the AI behind it. It's really just centered on the people and how this is going to help people do more things in their life in a positive way. So I've showed you two really great examples of what makes a good story, right? So it's about people. It's easy to understand. So I could put these two videos in front of my first grader and my grandmother who doesn't know how to use email, and they would come away saying, oh, that's cool. That technology is really cool. It's again, not difficult to understand, and it's impactful and really centered on people. So those are really the hallmarks of what makes a really good story. So we do this every day on my communications team. I'm super lucky that I have full-time communication colleagues at Microsoft that we collaborate with. And then I also have my We agency team who are like my right-hand sidekicks. And we brainstorm, we iterate. We start with a blank page and we start iterating and saying, okay, here's the crux of a story. Here is a shell. Here's where I think the market is. Here's what our analysts are saying. Here's what our competitors are doing. And then here's why this technology matters. And we get in with our business partners in engineering and marketing. I want to talk to the people who develop this. I ask a ton of questions. So you have to be an investigative journalist within your own company, and you really need to dig in and ask questions. One of the things I probably say 10 times a day is, that is super cool. But in my mind, I'm like, I don't really understand this. And then I say, this is really interesting. Can you explain that acronym and then explain it to me like I'm a third grader? And what I'm trying to do in that instance is I'm trying to get people who are really, really technical to explain it in that easy to understand language. Because then I take the technical info, I take their description in that third grade language, and I kind of mash it together, and I find these stories, right? I want to know about the interesting details. I want to know about the SwiftKey engineer, the young woman that was interviewed, whose brother's nonverbal in Riverside School. I want to talk to her. That's the crux of that story, and that's how we found that, where she developed it because she had a challenge and knew her brother would respond well to technology, and they were using paper. She's like, I can develop an app for that. So think of those kind of details that you can find in your organization and then build your story around it. And then when you get to the editing phase, clear language, easy to understand. So these are things we do every single day at Microsoft on my communications team. So I hope you have a few tools in your tool belt that you can try out when you're at work and try out some of these tactics. And so now that you know how to find your story, I encourage you to sail off into the sunset with your story. So thank you.
I think there's two things going on with your work here. There's an this is the microphone. You got it? Okay. There are two things. There's an internal thing and there's an external thing. The internal thing is basically you're the one who's got to speak to the technologists to make sense of what they're doing, right? How hard of a conversation is that?
You know, it's really interesting. I think I'm a journalist at heart, having been trained in my undergrad years in a journalism major. I love talking to people and understanding, like, what do you do? How do you do this? How do you build this, right? I was fascinated by the earlier conversations today. So they can be difficult, but it's mostly because they talk in a different language from me. I'm looking for the creative and the story and the color and the details that I can build out. Who can I talk to? Who can I interview? And they're like, I want to talk to you how we built this, and let me show you like the pages and pages of tests and results. And I'm like, I don't know what that means, and acronyms. So it can be really challenging. But what I find is sitting down with people, coffee, meetings, asking questions, and I'm very humble, and I think most of my communication colleagues are. It's like, hey, this is my area of expertise. I totally respect with you what you do, and we need to work together. And I find that those conversations are really fruitful, and just I ask a lot of questions to say, okay, explain to me how this works.
And so obviously they see that you're asking them incredible questions. I mean, we were talking a bit today, and especially as we heard from our last conversation from Angela and Jasmine, where content strategists almost have to play that human interface role between the technologists and what the user wants, and they have some influence over that. For you as the storyteller and the communicator, do you have that same level of influence? Obviously, you're translating what those technologists are doing, but do they ever listen to you and say, oh, wait a minute, we should probably be bringing some of that human element into the product
it's
itself?
interesting. It does go both ways. So I was on a project in the fall where I heard from, I knew we were doing a big moment, like our CMO, Chris Capostella, on stage. We're going to share all our Surface devices, and it's a big deal for us, and it was all for our holiday campaign of devices. And I was hearing from my engineering partners that they're like, oh, this is a terrible experience and on one of our products, like user experience. And I'm like, oh, and this was like in a couple months ahead of time. I'm like, well, explain to me what that means. Like, I don't even know what that means. And they told me. And I was like, wow, we really need to fix that. And so the engineers are like, yeah, we don't have resourcing or budget for that. And I'm like, well, I heard in my comms meetings that, execs are going to get on stage and show this up in 3 months. So I just sent an email to the head of engineering of that business and said, hey, this is what we're doing. I heard from your engineering team that there's no resources, and I highly recommend we get some resources there so we can fix some of these issues. And so that really wasn't my job when I decided to be a communicator at Microsoft on the AI team, but I realized like it does go both ways, and that was one where I was like, wow, I'm so glad I did that. The event turned out great. The engineers were able to fix some of those challenges in those 3 months, and it was a non-issue. So it does very much go both ways.
And that's a great story, and this actually gets to my vision for what I think we as communication leaders want to be. We're not just the people who externally communicate the values and products of a company, but should be the ones who act as agents of translation and transformation, can sort of have the big picture of what's going on with the organization and can catalyze that kind of change that makes things better. And that's what I hope people open up to the communicators as we think about that interface between technology and user. Yeah. So that's really great. The second question, my last question, is to the videos themselves in terms of, you're basically trying to get people to trust you, to use these technologies. And AI, as you've heard today, there's a lot of trepidation around this. Now, you're not going to tell me that the only answer to building trust is using kids in a video, right?
No.
So,
No.
So, I mean, what is there a fundamental takeaway in terms of, this is not just using Alexa or a computer. These are game-changing technologies. How do we go about building that trust other than showing a pretty story, you think?
That's a great question. I think, from my perspective, where I sit is we're always trying to really understand the technology that we're building. And from a business and engineering perspective, we're trying to do that in a responsible way. So, on the business end, let's create these committees, both internal and external, where we're leading the industry on building responsible AI technologies. And then on the communications front, we want to make sure we're communicating that. So everything we do is all centered on trust. So we just make sure that we're always sharing that with our audiences.
Great. Kerry, thanks very much. I appreciate your time. That's great. Thank you. Kerry Schimmelbusch. As you may have noticed of our last two presentations, I just wanted to lead some of the Q&A just to help feed this final exercise. After the exercise, we're going to have a conversation with the two tech reporters from KUOW who host the podcast Primed, where I'm hoping that for those of you who remain with us after we go through this third interaction, that we can actually debrief a little bit more around some of the bigger ideas that we've had, because as I mentioned at the outset, we're trying to put together this declaration of communication leadership that we want to put out to the world. And I would love to just maybe capture some of the practices, principles, and ideas that may have germinated at your tables that we would possibly use to put that out in the coming weeks or so. So that is where we're going with the rest of our time together. And so I'm looking forward to interacting with you a little more directly when we get a chance to do that. So with that in mind, we're going to go to Molly to present the last element that we have to play with. Molly.
Yes, last element to play with. I like that language. All right, so on to activity number 3, our final activity. So now you are back to being the airport official. Okay, so from activity 1, you are the role of the airport official, but keep in mind the persona that you focused on, the community that you focused on in the second activity. So now we want you to consider the decision to implement the AI from the position of the airport official with that in mind, and then how would you explain that decision to that persona? So if you're looking at the experience of the Uber driver and the airport has decided to implement AI, how would you explain that decision to that stakeholder? And so you want to think about their experience, you want to think about the ethics, all of those, the answers to those questions that you considered as a table during activity 2, that's where those come back into play. So are there any questions about what that is? We're going to give you 10 minutes to think about it, and then you can submit your responses to the poll. You can jot down ideas. You can come up with a couple sentences. Again, we're going to collect this information, and we will be sharing it back with everybody who is here after the fact. If we have some time, we might discuss it. But before I set the timer for 10 minutes, are there any questions? Because if you have a question, others might.
Did any table actually say no, they weren't going to adopt it? Okay.
Great.
I was actually expecting more tables to say no. So there's only one table that said no. That table
2,
said,
3?
oh man.
Okay.
So in those situations, there's a different question to the answer, right? Basically, if you said no, you're not going to adopt this technology, what do we want them to do?
Well, I think we want them to still explain why they said no, taking into consideration those ethical considerations. Yeah, I think to Hanson's point, we were surprised to see how many yeses there were based on what the presentations were. So we will be excited to see what your responses are. And we'll roam around too, so get our attention if you have questions. We'll set the timer for 10 minutes.